A male flight attendant dismisses a quiet female passenger, thinking she's just another traveler, until he learns she's his new manager. What happens next will surprise you. Stay tuned to find out how a single moment of judgment turns everything upside down, leaving him with a lesson he never saw coming. Before we jump into the story, comment below where you're watching from today, and if you enjoy this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss out on more surprising tales like this one. James adjusted his crisp uniform and smoothed his hair as he entered the first-class cabin of Emirates Flight 302, his polished shoes clicking sharply against the floor of the Dubai-bound aircraft. He prided himself on maintaining the highest standards of service for first-class passengers on these prestigious international routes. It was a busy morning at Heathrow Terminal 5, and he was determined to keep things running flawlessly. As the last few passengers boarded, James scanned the cabin with a practiced eye, making sure everything was in perfect order. Seated near the window in the first row was a tall black woman dressed in a well-fitted suit, her natural hair styled in an elegant updo. She was reading through what appeared to be business documents, occasionally making notes in the margins. Her presence seemed understated, though there was something confident about the way she carried herself. James noticed her raise her hand slightly, signaling for assistance, but he quickly averted his eyes. Instead, he turned to another passenger, a middle-aged white man in an expensive Italian suit who had just sat down and was adjusting his carry-on bag. "Good morning, sir," James said warmly, handing him a welcome champagne. "Let me know if there's anything I can do to make your flight more comfortable." The man smiled back, thanked him, and settled into his seat. From the corner of his eye, James saw the black woman lower her hand. He caught her subtle sigh, but ignored it. Something about her demeanor bothered him. "Why do some people act like they belong here when they clearly don't?" he thought to himself. His impression, based on nothing but a glance, fed his decision to attend to others instead of her. The woman quietly adjusted her seatbelt and returned to her papers, her expression calm, though a flicker of disappointment crossed her face. James continued his rounds, greeting each first-class passenger with his trademark charm. When he finally approached her row, he skipped over her entirely, focusing instead on a businessman across the aisle. The cabin settled as the plane prepared for takeoff. James moved through the pre-flight checks, his interaction smooth and professional, at least on the surface. But he could feel the woman's eyes on him. Though she never said a word, the tension simmered quietly in the air, unnoticed by most passengers but undeniable to him. As the flight began its journey over the English Channel, James busied himself with serving drinks and canapés. At one point, he passed by the woman's seat and heard her politely say, "Excuse me, could I get some water, please?" He stopped briefly, glanced at her, and nodded without a word. Instead of fetching the water himself, he delegated it to a junior attendant, Nathan, mumbling, "Handle that, will you?" before briskly walking away. The woman received her water with the same calm demeanor, but the faintest shadow of disappointment lingered in her expression. She returned to her documents, flipping through the pages with quiet focus. James didn't think much of it. To him, she was just another passenger, one who didn't seem to belong in a space he thought should reflect a certain image. He went back to his tasks, unaware that this quiet passenger was observing everything, every glance, every omission, every subtle slight. She wasn't angry, at least not outwardly, but there was a quiet resolve in her eyes, one that James didn't notice, or perhaps chose not to see. As the flight progressed over France and into the Mediterranean airspace, James maintained his cheerful facade, chatting with passengers and ensuring they were comfortable. He meticulously avoided interacting with the black woman, whom he now considered an unspoken annoyance. Every time he approached her row, He directed his attention to the other passengers seated nearby, offering refills and snacks with a bright smile. To anyone watching, it appeared seamless. To her, it was glaringly obvious. At one point, James noticed the woman putting away her documents and pulling out a tablet. She started tapping on it quietly, her posture calm and unbothered. He felt a small pang of irritation. What kind of person just sits there silently observing instead of making themselves more presentable or relatable? He shook the thought away, reassuring himself that he was just doing his job by focusing on the passengers he felt needed more attention. Halfway through the flight, as the plane soared over the Mediterranean Sea, an older gentleman seated in the middle of the cabin called James over. "Excuse me, young man, I believe the lady up front hasn't been served properly. I noticed you skipped over her a couple of times." James's smile faltered slightly, but he quickly recovered. "Oh, I must have missed her. I'll check on her now," he said with a tight nod, trying to sound apologetic. Inside, his irritation grew. Why did it matter? She wasn't complaining. Still, he walked to her row, his steps deliberate, his expression carefully neutral. "Ma'am," he said with practiced politeness, "is there anything else you need at the moment?" The woman looked up, meeting his gaze directly for the first time. Her calm eyes seemed to pierce through his cheerful mask. "I'm fine, thank you," she said, her tone even but firm. "You've been very attentive to everyone else, though I appreciate your thoroughness." James blinked momentarily, at a loss for words. Was she being sarcastic? Her tone didn't suggest it, but her words stung nonetheless. For the first time, he felt a flicker of self-consciousness about how he had handled himself. He wanted to say something to defend himself, but her steady gaze left no room for excuses. "Well, if you need anything, don't hesitate to ask," he said briskly, retreating before she could say more. His heart raced as he walked back toward the service area. Something about her presence unsettled him, but he couldn't pinpoint what it was. In the galley, James busied himself, hoping to shake off the strange feeling. He whispered to Nathan, "That woman in row 1, something about her just seems off. I can't explain it." Nathan, unaware of James's biases, simply nodded and returned to his work. James took a deep breath and straightened his shoulders. It was just a passenger after all. The flight would end soon, and he'd never have to think about her again, or so he thought. As the flight neared its descent into Dubai airspace, James focused on preparing the cabin for landing. His movements were quick and efficient, but his mind kept drifting back to the earlier interaction. He couldn't shake the unsettling feeling of the woman's calm response. It wasn't defiant or confrontational, but it carried an air of quiet authority that made him question himself. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the start of the descent and requesting that all passengers return to their seats. James moved through the cabin, ensuring everyone was buckled in and ready. When he reached row 1, he glanced at the woman again. She was seated upright, her hands resting on her tablet, but her eyes were fixed on him. For a brief moment, their gazes locked. He looked away quickly, feeling a twinge of discomfort. As he walked back to the galley, he overheard murmurs among the passengers. One whispered, "I think that woman up front is someone important." Another replied, "I notice she's got this presence about her, doesn't she?" James's ears perked up. Important? He dismissed the thought almost instantly. "She's just another passenger," he muttered to himself, clenching his jaw. Yet the seed of doubt was planted, and it gnawed at him. Why would people think she was significant? Her simple appearance didn't scream wealth or influence, and he'd seen plenty of high-profile travelers over his career. By the time the plane landed and taxied to the gate at Dubai International Airport, James was eager to end his shift and forget about the odd tension that had followed him throughout the flight. He stood near the cabin door, preparing to bid farewell to the passengers as they disembarked. His smile returned, though it felt more forced than usual. One by one, passengers gathered their belongings and filed out. James exchanged pleasantries with each, his tone bright and professional. When the woman from row 1 approached, she paused briefly before exiting. "Thank you for the flight," she said, her voice steady and courteous. But there was something in her tone, a layer of formality that sent a chill down his spine. James nodded automatically, unable to muster a verbal response. She held his gaze for a moment longer before stepping off the plane. The cabin emptied, and James let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. He shook his head, trying to brush off the lingering discomfort. It didn't matter who she was gone, and he could move on with his day. But as he gathered his belongings and prepared to debrief with the crew, James had no idea that this flight was just the beginning of his reckoning. The truth would hit him sooner than he expected, and it would change everything. James arrived at the crew lounge in the Emirates staff area, his steps brisk as he sought to put the flight behind him. He slipped into his usual spot at the debriefing table, his polished demeanor intact. The other crew members filtered in, chatting casually about the flight. James joined in the conversation, skillfully masking the unease lingering in the back of his mind. Midway through the debriefing, their supervisor, Mr. Patel, walked in. His presence was usually calm and unassuming, but today there was a certain stiffness in his posture. James noticed it immediately, his instincts telling him something was off. He held a clipboard in one hand and cleared his throat to silence the room. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mr. Patel began, his tone formal. "I'd like to introduce someone who will be joining us briefly today. She's here to share some exciting updates about our team and the direction of the airline." James straightened in his chair, intrigued but mildly annoyed. He was eager to finish the meeting and head to his hotel room. However, when the door opened and the woman from row 1 stepped into the room, his heart dropped. The air seemed to shift as she entered, her composed demeanor now more pronounced under the fluorescent lights. "Good afternoon," she said, her voice steady and commanding. "My name is Dr. Amara Wilson. I'm the newly appointed regional manager for Emirates Premium Cabin Services." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the group. James's breath caught, his face draining of color. Dr. Wilson's eyes scanned the room, making brief contact with each crew member before settling on James. She gave the faintest smile, not smug, but pointed. "It's a pleasure to meet all of you. I had the opportunity to observe the team firsthand during today's flight, and I must say it was illuminating." James felt a lump form in his throat. His palms grew clammy as the meaning behind her words sank in. She had been evaluating them, not as a passenger, but as their manager. The realization hit him like a freight train, and he struggled to keep his expression neutral. Dr. Wilson continued, addressing the team with professionalism. "I'm looking forward to working closely with all of you to ensure our passengers receive the highest standard of service. I believe there's always room for growth, and I'm confident we can achieve great things together." James's mind raced as she spoke. He replayed every interaction he'd had with her during the flight, each instance of dismissal and neglect. His stomach churned with dread. Had he already jeopardized his standing under this new leadership? When Dr. Wilson finished speaking, Mr. Patel stepped forward to conclude the meeting. "Thank you, Dr. Wilson. I'm sure the team is as excited as I am to collaborate with you." The crew murmured polite agreement, but James remained silent, his thoughts too tangled to form words. As the meeting ended and the crew began to disperse, James tried to slip out quietly, but as he reached the door, Dr. Wilson's voice stopped him cold. "Mr. Reynolds," she said evenly, "may I have a word with you before you leave?" James turned slowly, his face carefully composed, though his heart pounded in his chest. "Of course," he replied, forcing a smile. His pulse raced as he stepped back into the room, bracing himself for what was to come. James followed Dr. Wilson into a smaller adjoining office, the door closing behind them with an almost ominous finality. The air in the room felt heavier, and James struggled to maintain his composure. Dr. Wilson gestured for him to take a seat, her expression calm but unreadable. He hesitated briefly before sitting down, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Dr. Wilson remained standing, leaning slightly against the desk as she regarded him. "Mr. Reynolds," she began, her voice steady but carrying a weight that made James's stomach twist. "You've been with Emirates for several years, haven't you?" "Yes, ma'am," James replied quickly, his voice firm but tinged with nervousness. "I've been a flight attendant for 8 years. I take great pride in my work." Dr. Wilson nodded slowly, her gaze unwavering. "That's good to hear," she said. "Pride in one's work is important, but let me ask you something. What does providing excellent service mean to you?" James blinked, caught off guard by the question. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, scrambling for an answer that felt appropriate. "It means ensuring the passengers are comfortable and their needs are met," he said, his tone rehearsed, "making sure they have a positive experience." Dr. Wilson tilted her head slightly, her expression thoughtful. "Interesting," she said, pausing briefly. "Would you say that every passenger deserves the same level of service, regardless of how they look or what assumptions you might make about them?" The question hit James like a slap. His breath caught, and his carefully constructed mask began to crack. "Of course," he said quickly, but his voice faltered slightly. "Well, yes, I believe everyone deserves respect." Dr. Wilson's eyes narrowed slightly, her calm demeanor unshaken. "Respect is a key part of this job," she agreed, "and I want to believe that's what you strive for. But let me be clear. I observed things during today's flight that gave me pause." James's heart sank. His worst fears were being confirmed. He opened his mouth to respond, but Dr. Wilson held up a hand to stop him. "Let me finish," she said firmly. "I watched how you interacted with passengers, how you prioritized some while neglecting others. It wasn't overt, but it was clear enough. And I couldn't help but notice that your behavior toward me in particular stood out." James's face flushed red, and he looked down at his hands, unable to meet her gaze. "Dr. Wilson," he started, but she interrupted him again. "I'm not here to embarrass you or call you out," Dr. Wilson said, her tone softening slightly. "But I need you to understand that actions like those have consequences. They affect the passenger experience, the reputation of this airline, and most importantly, they reflect on you as a professional." James nodded silently, his throat tightening. He wanted to defend himself, to explain away his actions, but deep down he knew there was no excuse. The realization stung more than Dr. Wilson's words ever could. "I believe in second chances," Dr. Wilson continued, her voice steady, "but only if they're met with accountability and a willingness to change. Do you think you're ready to take a hard look at yourself and your behavior, Mr. Reynolds?" James's head snapped up, his eyes meeting hers for the first time. The weight of her words hung heavily in the air. He swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yes, ma'am, I am." Dr. Wilson straightened, nodding slightly. "Good," she said, "because this isn't just about you. It's about creating an environment where every passenger feels valued and respected. If you're willing to commit to that, then I'm willing to help you succeed." James nodded again, his voice too tight to respond. Dr. Wilson walked to the door, opening it and gesturing for him to leave. As he stepped out, his mind raced with a mixture of shame and determination. He had a lot to prove, not just to Dr. Wilson but to himself. James walked out of the office, his steps slow and measured. The weight of Dr. Wilson's words hung over him like a cloud, and for the first time in years, he felt unsure of himself. The confident, polished exterior he had always worn now felt like a brittle shell cracking under the pressure of self-reflection. In the crew lounge, the usual post-brief chatter buzzed around him, but James hardly noticed. He caught snippets of conversations about Dr. Wilson, how professional she seemed, how poised, and how her leadership style already felt different from anything they'd experienced before. James kept his head down, avoiding eye contact as he gathered his things. As he stepped out into the warm Dubai evening, the desert heat hit him, but it did little to calm his nerves. James replayed the flight in his mind, his interactions with Dr. Wilson now glaringly obvious in hindsight. Every dismissive glance, every skipped interaction, every assumption he'd made each one now felt like a sharp jab to his conscience. He sat in the crew shuttle for a moment, gripping the armrest tightly. He thought about Dr. Wilson's question. Was he ready to take a hard look at himself and change? It wasn't the first time James had heard feedback about his behavior, though none had been this direct. A few years ago, a supervisor had lightly mentioned his firm approach with certain passengers, but James had brushed it off. He had convinced himself that he was just maintaining high standards. Now those moments resurfaced with uncomfortable clarity. James sighed and leaned back in his seat, his thoughts swirling. He wasn't used to feeling this way, doubtful, vulnerable, exposed. Yet beneath the discomfort there was a flicker of something else, the faintest hint of resolve. If Dr. Wilson was giving him a second chance, he couldn't afford to waste it. The next day, James arrived at the Emirates headquarters for his briefing. His stomach churned with nerves as he clocked in. He noticed a memo posted on the bulletin board. It was an announcement about a new training initiative focusing on inclusivity and customer relations, led by none other than Dr. Amara Wilson. James felt his chest tighten as he read the details. All crew members were expected to participate, and the sessions would include a mix of workshops, discussions, and role-playing exercises. Great, James muttered under his breath. The last thing he wanted was to relive the humiliation of yesterday's confrontation in front of his colleagues, but deep down, he knew he didn't have a choice. Dr. Wilson's words echoed in his mind. Actions like those have consequences. As he prepared for the day's flight to Bangkok, James felt the weight of his actions pressing down on him. For the first time, he saw the passengers boarding not as faces to be categorized and judged, but as individuals with stories, experiences, and feelings. It was a small shift, but it unsettled him. He realized how much he had taken for granted and how much he still had to learn. James's first training session under Dr. Wilson's new initiative was scheduled for the following week, and the anticipation made the days leading up to it feel like a countdown to judgment. The session wasn't just a workshop. It was mandatory for all crew members, and James suspected that Dr. Wilson had a particular interest in observing his participation. When the day finally arrived, James entered the training room with an air of forced confidence. He greeted his colleagues politely, though he noticed a few glances exchanged as he took his seat. The room was set up in a semicircle, with Dr. Wilson standing at the front, tablet in hand. Her presence was commanding yet approachable, and the crew seemed both intrigued and slightly nervous. "Good morning, everyone," Dr. Wilson began, her voice steady and engaging. "Thank you for being here today. This session is not just about policies or procedures. It's about understanding the impact of our actions and the culture we create as a team." James shifted in his chair, suddenly feeling smaller under her words. He glanced around and noticed his colleagues nodding, some even looking eager. For James, the room felt heavier with each passing moment. Dr. Wilson continued, sharing a story from her past. She spoke of a time early in her career when she had been overlooked and underestimated, not because of her abilities, but because of how others had perceived her. Her voice didn't waver as she described the quiet humiliation of being ignored, the frustration of being judged by assumptions rather than actions. As she spoke, James felt a lump form in his throat. Her words mirrored the very behavior he had exhibited during the flight. He stared at his hands, twisting them in his lap, unable to meet her gaze. For the first time, he fully understood what it must have felt like for Dr. Wilson in that cabin, silent, unnoticed, and judged. The session moved on to group discussions. Each team was asked to share experiences where they had felt judged or seen others treated unfairly. When it was James's turn to speak, he hesitated, his mouth dry. He glanced at Dr. Wilson, who was observing from across the room, her expression neutral but attentive. James cleared his throat. "I've been thinking a lot about my actions recently," he began hesitantly. "During one of my flights, I made assumptions about a passenger. I didn't give them the attention they deserved, and I realize now how wrong that was." His voice wavered, and he felt the weight of his colleagues' eyes on him. He braced himself for judgment, but instead there was silence. Not the cold, critical silence he had expected, but a thoughtful, almost understanding pause. "It's hard to admit when we've made mistakes, Doctor," Wilson said, stepping in gently. "But acknowledgement is the first step toward change. What matters most is what we do moving forward." James nodded slightly, his cheeks flushed. For the rest of the session, he listened intently, taking in every exercise and discussion. When the workshop ended, he lingered near the back of the room, unsure whether to leave or approach Dr. Wilson. Before he could decide, Dr. Wilson walked over to him, her expression kind, but serious. "That was a good start, James," she said quietly. "You spoke up, and that's not easy. But remember, actions speak louder than words. Keep showing me you're willing to change." James nodded, his voice too tight to respond. As Dr. Wilson turned to leave, he felt a flicker of determination rise within him. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, he believed it might be possible to make things right, not just with Dr. Wilson, but with himself. The days following the training session were a whirlwind of emotions for James. He replayed his confession over and over in his mind, scrutinizing every word, every pause. Although he felt relieved to have acknowledged his mistake, the weight of proving himself loomed larger than ever. He couldn't escape the feeling that everyone, from his colleagues to Dr. Wilson, was watching him, waiting to see if he would falter again. On his next flight, a long haul to Sydney, James found himself unusually aware of every interaction. He carefully adjusted his tone when speaking to passengers, made a conscious effort to maintain eye contact, and went out of his way to ensure no one felt overlooked. It was exhausting, but he was determined to be better. During the meal service, James approached an elderly woman who had been sitting quietly by the window in economy class. The woman's weathered hands fumbled with the tray table as she tried to place her drink. James knelt beside her, steadying the cup and offering a warm smile. "Let me help you with that, ma'am," he said gently. The woman looked up, surprised but grateful. "Thank you, dear," she said softly. James felt a flicker of satisfaction at the simple interaction. It was such a small gesture, but it felt significant proof that he could make meaningful changes even in the smallest moments. On the aisle, he noticed a young black man struggling to fit his bag into the overhead compartment. Without hesitation, James stepped forward and offered assistance, his voice kind and unhurried. "Let me take care of that for you," he said, lifting the bag and securing it in place. The man thanked him with a smile, and James nodded, feeling a small sense of pride. Yet for every step forward, James couldn't shake the shadow of his past actions. He caught himself overthinking, second-guessing every interaction, worrying that his efforts might come across as insincere. The anxiety lingered, making him acutely aware of how far he still had to go. Later, during a quiet moment in the galley, one of his colleagues, Nathan, approached him. "Hey, James," he said casually, leaning against the counter. "I've noticed you've been different lately. More attentive, I guess. Is everything okay?" James hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. He glanced around to make sure no one else was listening before responding. "I've just been thinking a lot about how I do my job," he admitted. "Trying to make sure I'm treating everyone the way they deserve to be treated." Nathan raised an eyebrow, a small smile playing on his lips. "Well, whatever you're doing, it's working. I think people are noticing." He patted James on the shoulder before heading back to his station, leaving James with a mix of relief and nervousness. As the plane landed and passengers began to disembark, James positioned himself at the door, his smile softer but more genuine than it had been in weeks. One by one, passengers thanked him as they exited. A few even complimented his kindness and attentiveness. Among the last to leave was Dr. Wilson. She had been traveling on this flight, seated discreetly in the back, observing the crew without announcing her presence. When she reached James at the door, she paused, giving him a measured look. "Good work today," she said quietly, her words simple but meaningful. James's heart lifted at the praise. "Thank you," he replied, his voice steady but earnest. He watched as she walked down the jet bridge, her figure disappearing into the crowd. For the first time in a long time, James felt a glimmer of hope that he was on the right path, but he also knew his journey was far from over. Every flight, every interaction would be another test of his commitment to change, and he was ready to face it. The following week, James found himself scheduled for another training session. This one focused on role-playing scenarios to address unconscious bias and improve communication with passengers. The idea of participating in more hands-on activities made him uneasy, but he knew this was part of the process. When he entered the training room, the atmosphere was more relaxed than before. Crew members chatted in small groups, and the trainers were arranging chairs in a circle. James scanned the room and saw Dr. Wilson standing near the back, speaking with one of the facilitators. She glanced his way briefly, giving a small nod that sent a jolt of nerves through him. The session began with a warm-up exercise where participants were asked to describe what they thought made a good flight experience. Answers varied from friendly service to attention to detail, but James stayed quiet, listening intently. When it was his turn, he hesitated before answering. "I think a good flight experience means making every passenger feel seen and respected," he said, his voice softer than usual. He avoided looking at Dr. Wilson, but felt her attention nonetheless. The facilitator smiled. "That's a great point, James. Respect is a key part of this job." The group moved on to the role-playing activity. Each person was assigned a scenario that required them to interact with a challenging passenger. James's scenario involved assisting a passenger with limited English skills, and as he stepped forward to begin, he felt the weight of the room's eyes on him. "Hello, sir," he began, addressing the trainer playing the role of the passenger. "How can I assist you today?" The trainer mimed confusion, pointing at an imaginary menu and speaking in a mix of broken English and gestures. James paused, his mind racing as he tried to find the right approach. He crouched slightly to meet the passenger's eye level, softening his tone. "It's okay," he said gently, pointing to the pretend menu. "This one or this one." He exaggerated his gestures, making his meaning clear without sounding condescending. The trainer nodded enthusiastically, and the exercise ended with applause from the group. "Good job, James," the facilitator said. "You showed patience and adaptability. That's exactly what we're aiming for." James exhaled deeply, a mixture of relief and pride washing over him. He returned to his seat, his confidence slowly building. Throughout the rest of the session, he observed his colleagues with fresh eyes, noticing their strengths and areas where they too struggled. When the training ended, Dr. Wilson addressed the group, her tone encouraging yet firm. "I've seen progress from many of you," she said, "but progress isn't a finish line. It's a continuous effort, and we all have room to grow." As the crew began to leave, Dr. Wilson approached James. "That was better," she said, her words measured but sincere. "You're starting to understand what it means to meet people where they are." James nodded, his heart racing. "Thank you, I'm trying." Dr. Wilson studied him for a moment before speaking again. "Keep going. This isn't about one session or one flight. It's about building habits, good ones, and letting them define how you approach every situation." James felt the weight of her words and nodded again, more firmly this time. As she turned to leave, he realized he wasn't just trying to prove himself to her anymore. He was proving something to himself, and he wasn't about to stop now. The days that followed were filled with subtle but deliberate efforts on James's part to change how he approached his work. He paid closer attention to his interactions with passengers and colleagues, consciously checking himself whenever old habits threatened to resurface. He knew he was under scrutiny, not just by Dr. Wilson, but by his peers who had grown curious about his transformation. On his next flight, a challenging route to Lagos with a full cabin, James encountered a situation that tested his resolve. A young mother boarded with her toddler, the child fussing and crying. As they made their way down the aisle, passengers exchanged irritated glances, and James felt the familiar rush of frustration. He caught himself immediately, taking a deep breath before stepping forward. "Hi there," James said, crouching slightly to address the mother. "Traveling with little ones can be tough. Can I help with your bag or anything else you might need?" The mother looked up, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Oh, thank you," she said, handing James a small backpack. "I wasn't expecting her to be this fussy." "It happens," James said warmly, securing the bag in the overhead compartment. "Let me know if there's anything else I can do." The mother smiled, a look of relief washing over her face. James felt a quiet sense of satisfaction as he returned to his station. For the rest of the flight, he kept an eye on the pair, occasionally offering small gestures of support, a bottle of water, an extra blanket, a kind word. Passengers around them began to relax, and James realized how much his attitude could influence the atmosphere in his section. Toward the end of the flight, one of the senior attendants, Lisa, approached him. "I have to say, James, you've been different lately," Lisa said, her tone curious, but not unkind. "More patient, more thoughtful." James hesitated, unsure how much to share. "I guess I've just been trying to be better at noticing people," he said finally. "It's easy to get caught up in the routine and forget what really matters." Lisa nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Well, it shows. Keep it up." As the plane landed and passengers began to disembark, Dr. Dayshear Lees Wilson, who had been traveling discreetly, lingered at the back of the line. When she reached James, she stopped and regarded him for a moment. "I saw what you did for the young mother," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "That's the kind of service this airline needs: compassion, attentiveness, and professionalism." James felt a swell of pride, but tempered it with humility. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "I've been working on it." Dr. Wilson nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Good. Keep working. It's not about perfection. It's about progress." As she walked away, James stood at the cabin door, his mind racing. Dr. Wilson's words stayed with him, not as a judgment, but as a challenge, a reminder that every day brought new opportunities to grow. For the first time, he began to see his role not just as a job, but as a chance to make a difference, one interaction at a time. James's progress continued, but it wasn't without its challenges. On a particularly busy flight to Hong Kong, he found himself slipping back into old habits. The cabin was full, tensions were high, and a passenger, a sharply dressed woman in business attire, called him over with a brisk wave. Her tone was curt as she asked for her drink, barely glancing up from her laptop. James felt irritation rising within him. He wanted to respond with equal coldness to match her dismissive energy, but he caught himself, taking a breath. He reminded himself of Dr. Wilson's words, "Every interaction is an opportunity." He placed the drink on the woman's tray table with a calm, professional smile. "Here you go, ma'am. Let me know if you need anything else," he said evenly. The woman barely acknowledged him, but James felt a quiet satisfaction in handling the situation with grace rather than letting his frustration dictate his response. Moments later, he noticed another passenger struggling to open a snack packet. It was a small, seemingly insignificant thing, but James stepped in without hesitation. "Let me help you with that," he said, taking the packet and opening it with ease before handing it back with a smile. The passenger thanked him, and James moved on, feeling a sense of accomplishment in these small gestures. Later, during a lull in the service, James reflected on how much he had changed. In the past, he might have brushed off these interactions, viewing them as interruptions or annoyances. Now, he saw them as chances to show kindness and professionalism, qualities he had taken for granted before. When the plane landed and the crew gathered for the post-flight debriefing, James noticed Dr. Wilson sitting quietly at the back, observing. She wasn't required to attend every meeting, but her presence had become a quiet motivator for James. He found himself wanting to prove to her and to himself that he could rise to the standards she had set. During the debrief, the captain praised the crew for their handling of a minor delay during boarding. James's name was mentioned specifically for his attentiveness to passengers, and he felt a ripple of pride. He glanced at Dr. Wilson, who gave him a small nod of approval. After the meeting, James lingered in the lounge, organizing his notes and preparing for his next flight. Dr. Wilson approached him, her expression thoughtful. "You've been consistent," she said simply. "That's important." James looked up, surprised but grateful. "Thank you. I've been trying." Dr. Wilson studied him for a moment before speaking again. "There's still room to grow, but I can see you're taking this seriously. That's a good sign." Her words carried weight, but they also left James with a sense of responsibility. He knew he wasn't done proving himself not to Dr. Wilson, not to his colleagues, and certainly not to the passengers who entrusted him with their experience. As Dr. Salias Wilson walked away, he resolved to keep pushing forward, knowing that the real test of his growth was yet to come. The next test of James's resolve came unexpectedly during a challenging international flight to Johannesburg. The plane was fully booked and the crew was stretched thin. A mix of families, business travelers, and elderly passengers filled the cabin, creating a diverse and lively atmosphere, but also one ripe for tension. Early into the flight, James noticed an older man seated near the middle of the cabin. He seemed anxious, fidgeting with his seatbelt and repeatedly glancing at his watch. James approached with his usual professional smile. "Is everything all right, sir? Can I help you with anything?" The man looked up, his face lined with worry. "I'm not used to flying," he admitted, his voice trembling slightly. "This is only my second flight ever. I'm nervous about being so far up in the air." James knelt slightly to meet his eye level, his voice calm and reassuring. I understand, sir. It can be overwhelming, but you're in good hands. We've got a great crew and a very experienced captain. Would you like some water? Or maybe a pillow to make you more comfortable? The man nodded gratefully. Water would be nice, thank you. As James fetched the water, he noticed another passenger, a woman traveling alone with a baby, struggling to calm her crying child. The baby's wails were beginning to draw irritated glances from nearby passengers, and the woman looked close to tears. James paused, weighing the situation. He could easily have delegated one of these tasks to a colleague, but something in his gut told him to handle it himself. He returned to the older man with his water, offering a few more words of reassurance before heading toward the mother. Hi there, James said gently. It looks like you've got your hands full. Can I hold her for a moment while you get settled? The woman hesitated for a moment, then nodded, her face a mix of exhaustion and relief. James carefully took the baby into his arms, rocking her gently as the mother adjusted her bags and organized her seat. Within minutes, the baby began to calm, her cries fading into soft hiccups. James handed her back to her mother with a warm smile. There we go. Let me know if there's anything else you need. Passengers nearby, who had initially looked annoyed, now gave James nods of approval. One even murmured, You handled that beautifully. James felt a rush of pride, not the kind that came from seeking recognition, but the quiet kind that stemmed from doing the right thing. As the flight progressed, James continued to manage his section with care, his interactions thoughtful and deliberate. He helped an elderly woman adjust her oxygen mask, took extra time to explain the in-flight menu to a passenger who struggled with English, and ensured a young boy traveling alone felt safe and looked after. When the flight finally landed, James was exhausted but satisfied. As passengers disembarked, many stopped to thank him personally, some even mentioning how much they appreciated his kindness. The older man, who had been nervous about flying, gave him a warm handshake. You made this experience much better for me, he said sincerely. Thank you for your patience. James smiled, his chest swelling with pride. It was my pleasure, sir. Have a wonderful day. As he stood by the door, Dr. Wilson once again lingered near the end of the line. Her presence no longer surprised him. He had come to expect her quiet observations. This time, however, her expression carried something new, a trace of genuine approval. Impressive work today, Dr. Wilson said as she approached. You've come a long way, James. Her words, though simple, carried immense weight. James nodded, feeling the truth of her statement settle within him. For the first time, he realized he wasn't just performing for her approval. The changes he had made were becoming second nature, a part of who he was as a person and a professional. Thank you, James said quietly. I'm starting to see things differently now. Dr. Wilson gave a small nod, her tone softening. That's what growth looks like. Keep going with that. She walked away, leaving James standing at the cabin door, feeling more determined than ever to continue proving not just to Dr. Wilson, but to himself that he had truly changed. The weeks following that flight seemed to pass in a blur, with James continuously striving to apply what he had learned. The small victories helping a nervous passenger feel at ease, ensuring an elderly traveler had everything they needed had begun to pile up. Every positive interaction strengthened James's resolve, but the pressure to maintain this new level of attentiveness weighed on him. One afternoon, during a long-haul flight to New York, James found himself facing another challenge that tested his transformation. The flight was packed, and the cabin was filled with the usual hustle and bustle. A father in the front row was traveling with a toddler who seemed to be on the verge of a tantrum. James had seen the signs: restlessness, tugging at his clothes, whining. But this was different. The moment James made eye contact with the father, the toddler began to cry loudly, his small body racked with sobs. James's first instinct was to move toward the front of the plane and offer assistance, but he hesitated for a moment. This wasn't just a simple request for help. It was a situation that was likely to draw attention. There were several other passengers nearby who were already visibly annoyed by the noise, and James could feel the tension building. Taking a deep breath, James approached the father with a calm smile. "Hi there," he said softly. "It looks like he's a little upset. Can I help with anything?" The father gave James a desperate look, clearly overwhelmed. "I'm sorry. I don't know what's wrong. He won't calm down. I'm just trying to get him to sleep, but he's fighting it." James's heart softened. He could see how exhausted the father was, and the baby's crying was adding a layer of tension that no one needed. "I can help," James said gently. He offered to hold the child while the father organized his things. He hadn't held a baby like this in years, but it felt natural. James rocked the little boy softly, speaking to him in calming tones, and soon enough, the crying began to lessen as the baby settled. James could feel the eyes of the passengers on him. Some of them stared openly, others gave approving nods. James remained focused on the child, ignoring the subtle whispers and stares. He wasn't doing this for recognition. He was doing it because it was the right thing to do. After a few minutes, the toddler had calmed enough to doze off in James's arms. James carefully returned him to the father, who smiled gratefully. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice filled with relief. "You've been so kind. I don't know what I would have done." "It's no problem at all," James replied, offering a warm smile. "It happens. You just need a little help sometimes." The passengers around them had quieted, and James felt a sense of quiet pride. He hadn't let his nerves or the awkwardness of the moment stop him. He had simply acted with compassion, and it had made all the difference. Later, during the post-flight debriefing, James noticed that Dr. Wilson was again in attendance, quietly observing the crew as they discussed the flight. When the meeting concluded, Dr. Wilson approached him. There was something different in her expression this time, a subtle nod of approval, but also something deeper. "I saw what you did with the father and the child," Dr. Wilson said, her voice low. "That wasn't easy to do, especially with the attention you were getting, but you handled it with grace." James's throat tightened, and he glanced away, unsure of how to respond. I didn't want anyone to feel uncomfortable. I saw how stressed the father was, and it just seemed like the right thing to do." Dr. Wilson paused, her eyes studying him. "You've made a lot of progress, James. I've watched you adapt, not just in the big moments, but in the small ones too. That's what sets a great flight attendant apart." James's heart swelled with a quiet sense of accomplishment. For so long, he had focused on making everything look perfect, on meeting expectations, on fulfilling his duties. But now he understood that it was the moments of real connection, the moments when you chose to be kind, to listen, to help that truly defined the quality of service. As the crew dispersed and James gathered his things, he felt a shift within himself. He wasn't just improving his performance anymore. He was becoming someone he could be proud of. And that, James realized, was the real victory. He was starting to see himself as more than just a flight attendant. He was becoming someone who could make a difference, one interaction at a time, and that meant more than anything. As James moved through the following weeks, the sense of purpose he had been cultivating continued to grow. The lessons learned in training, Dr. Wilson's guidance, and his own self-reflection had begun to change the way he approached his work. But one particular day brought an unexpected challenge that forced James to confront everything he had learned. It was a routine flight to Singapore, nothing out of the ordinary at first. The crew was efficient, The passengers were cooperative, and the cabin was relatively calm. But when James reached the back of the plane to check on a few passengers, he overheard a conversation that caught his attention. Two passengers seated toward the rear were discussing something in hushed tones. James couldn't make out the words at first, but as he drew closer, he realized they were talking about the woman in the seat next to them. She was a black passenger dressed in a simple black dress and cardigan, and the two passengers seemed to be making disparaging remarks about her. She doesn't look like she belongs in business class. One of the men whispered to his companion, his voice laced with judgment. James froze, the words cutting through him like a sharp knife. "Yeah," the woman replied, her tone equally dismissive. "You'd think she'd dress more professionally if she wants to be taken seriously." James's heart pounded in his chest. He knew they were talking about the woman next to them, and the implication was clear. They were questioning her right to be in business class based solely on her appearance. For a moment, James hesitated. He had seen this kind of thing before: whispers, judgment, assumptions made based on appearance. It was all too familiar, but something within James snapped. He wasn't going to let this pass without standing up for the passenger. He walked straight up to the two of them, his voice firm but calm. "I'm sorry, but I overheard your conversation," he said, meeting their eyes directly. "And I have to tell you that making assumptions based on appearance is not only unfair, it's unacceptable." The two passengers blinked, caught off guard by James's sudden approach. The man opened his mouth to protest, but James continued. "Everyone here, regardless of how they dress or how they look, has the same right to be treated with respect," he added. "We do not judge our passengers here." There was a long pause as the two passengers looked at each other, unsure of how to respond. James stood his ground, his posture unyielding. He wasn't backing down. Finally, the man muttered an apology, though it seemed reluctant. The woman shifted uncomfortably, but said nothing. James turned and walked away, his heart still racing, but also filled with a sense of relief. He had spoken up, and for the first time, it didn't feel like a struggle. It felt like the right thing to do. When James returned to the front of the cabin, he couldn't help but glance back at the black passenger who had been the subject of the conversation. She met his gaze and offered a small, appreciative nod. James returned the gesture, his chest swelling with pride. He hadn't just stood up for her in that moment. He had stood up for something much larger. He had stood up for dignity, respect, and equality. And in that moment, James knew that he had truly changed. Later, during the post-flight debriefing, Dr. Wilson was there again, observing quietly from the back. When the meeting concluded, she came over to James, her usual reserved expression softened by something else: respect, maybe, or admiration. "You handled yourself well today," she said quietly. "That wasn't easy." James nodded, his hand slightly trembling from the adrenaline that still coursed through him. "I just couldn't let it go. I knew I had to do something." "Doctor." Wilson studied him for a moment, her gaze intense but kind. "You're starting to understand that it's not just about doing your job well. It's about making a difference in the lives of the people around you." James felt a deep, quiet pride as he absorbed her words. He hadn't just been performing his duty. He had been living out the values he had come to understand, the values that had guided his transformation. The work wasn't done, but James finally felt like he was on the right path. He smiled at Dr. Prosen. Wilson, a genuine smile this time, one that came from a place of true understanding. "I think I'm starting to get it," he said, and as Dr. Wilson nodded in acknowledgement, James knew that he had crossed a threshold. The changes he had made weren't just professional, they were personal, and they would define him moving forward. The days that followed felt different for James. He had always prided himself on being a good flight attendant, someone who got the job done with efficiency and professionalism. But now, he felt a deeper sense of purpose in every action, a purpose that went beyond simply following procedures. He felt responsible for the passengers' well-being, not just in the logistical sense, but emotionally too. Every interaction had the potential to make a difference. One morning, James was preparing for another long-haul flight to Tokyo. As he walked through the airport terminal, his mind was clear, focused on the day ahead. It was early, and the bustle of the terminal hadn't yet reached full swing. He walked past the check-in counters, past the long lines of travelers, and then stopped to double-check his flight manifest. His heart sank as he saw the name of one of the passengers, Michael Thompson. Michael was a fellow flight attendant who had been known for his cold and dismissive demeanor. James had heard the whispers from other crew members, the rumors about Michael's lack of empathy and his strict, almost harsh approach with passengers. James had always avoided interacting with him directly, knowing there was an unspoken tension between them. But now, as James stood there in the terminal, he realized that avoiding Michael wasn't going to solve anything. It wasn't about confrontation, it was about understanding. He had to approach this differently. As James boarded the plane and prepared for takeoff, he knew this was another test of his growth. He wasn't just working with passengers, he was working alongside his peers, and Michael was part of that equation. Now, as the flight progressed, James kept an eye on Michael, who seemed distant and cold, as usual. But James could sense something else behind his stern exterior, certain discomfort, a hesitation in his actions. The way he served drinks quickly, almost mechanically, without making eye contact with passengers. The way he avoided helping with the younger or elderly passengers, subtly delegating tasks to others. During a brief break in service, James found himself standing next to Michael in the galley. The silence between them was palpable, but James knew he couldn't ignore the situation any longer. He cleared his throat and turned toward Michael. "Hey, Michael," James began softly, not wanting to sound intrusive but also needing to break the ice. "I know we don't talk much, but I've noticed how much pressure you're under. This job isn't easy, especially on these long flights." Michael glanced up, startled by the sudden attention. James saw the brief flicker of something in his eyes, a hint of surprise, maybe even relief that someone had acknowledged his struggles. But the walls quickly went up again, and Michael replied coldly, "I'm fine, just doing my job." James didn't back down. "I know, but I've been there, and if you ever need a hand with anything, don't hesitate to ask. We're all in this together, right?" Michael didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked away, fidgeting with the service card. James couldn't tell if he had made any impact, but he could sense that his words had at least cracked the surface, even if just a little. Later, when the flight neared its descent, James found himself checking in on Michael once more. This time, he saw a subtle change. Michael was gentler with the passengers, offering a smile here and there, even making brief eye contact with those he served. It wasn't much, but James could tell it was something. When the flight landed, the crew gathered for the usual debriefing. Michael didn't avoid James this time. In fact, he approached him directly as they were leaving the plane. "Thanks," Michael said quietly, his voice softer than usual. "It's not easy, you know, with the pressure. I guess I didn't realize how much I've been pushing people away." James nodded, understanding more than he let on. "We all have our moments," he said, offering a reassuring smile. "You're not alone in this, and honestly, I think you're doing a lot better than you give yourself credit for." Michael looked at James for a long moment, then nodded, almost imperceptibly. "Maybe I've been a little too harsh," he admitted. "It's just how I was taught to do things, but I'm trying to learn." He paused, his voice quieter now. "I'm not sure I'm as good at it as you are, though." James smiled. We're all learning. It's a process. As they parted ways, James couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. It wasn't a huge breakthrough, but it was a start. Michael had opened up, and in doing so, had taken the first step toward understanding something that James had already begun to grasp. That growth wasn't just about improving yourself, but also about extending the same understanding and patience to others. James walked away knowing that change wasn't always immediate, but every small moment, every conversation, every attempt to make a difference added up. And for James, that meant more than anything. The next few weeks felt like a turning point for James. He had shifted from simply trying to manage his own growth to actively fostering a sense of camaraderie among the crew. The tension that had once existed between him and some of his colleagues, especially Michael, seemed to dissolve, replaced by a quiet understanding. Michael had begun to open up in small ways, taking more initiative with passengers, and even asking James for advice now and then. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. One morning, during a particularly busy flight to Paris, James found himself back in the galley organizing supplies. The plane was packed with passengers, and the hum of conversation and the rustle of seat belts filled the air as the crew prepared for service. He was about to start the drink round when a flight attendant from another crew, Sophia, approached him with a concerned look on her face. "James, can I talk to you for a second?" Sophia asked, her voice lowered. James turned toward her, sensing something serious in Sophia's tone. "Of course, what's up?" James replied, stepping away from the service cart. "I overheard a conversation," Sophia began, her eyes scanning the cabin. "It's about one of the passengers, a man in row 4. I think he might have." "Well, he might be making some of the other passengers uncomfortable." James frowned, a knot tightening in his stomach. "What do you mean?" Sophia hesitated before continuing. "He's been making some very inappropriate comments. He was talking loudly about the flight crew, calling one of the attendants unqualified and another too young for the job. And I heard him saying some racial comments about the passengers sitting near him. It's uncomfortable, James. It's creating a bad atmosphere back here." James's stomach turned as the weight of the situation settled in. He didn't have to ask to know which passengers were the targets of those comments. He had seen the man in question earlier. The man had made a dismissive remark about the steward's uniform, and James had already noticed him glaring at the couple seated next to him. A young black woman and her partner. "Thanks for telling me, Sophia," James said firmly, already making his way toward the man's seat. "I'll take care of it." Sophia nodded, her face filled with concern. "Be careful, James. He's been making people uneasy all flight. You know how some passengers can be." James took a deep breath and approached row 4. He could hear the man muttering to his companion as James arrived. "Excuse me, sir," James said politely but with authority. The man turned, raising an eyebrow, clearly surprised that someone had approached him. "Yes?" he asked, his tone sharp. "I'm James, one of the flight attendants. I couldn't help but overhear some comments you made about other passengers and our crew. I'd like to remind you that we have a strict policy on respect here. We do not tolerate any form of discrimination or disrespectful behavior on this flight." James's voice was steady, his gaze unwavering. The man's expression faltered, and he opened his mouth to respond, but James didn't give him the chance. "I need you to keep your voice down, sir." James continued, his tone calm but unyielding. "You've made several passengers and crew members uncomfortable. If this continues, I will have to involve the captain." The man flushed, a mix of anger and embarrassment crossing his face. He opened his mouth again, but this time he seemed to reconsider. Instead of arguing, he merely muttered something under his breath and turned away, clearly annoyed but not willing to escalate things further. James stood still for a moment, watching him. The tension in the air was palpable, but James had said his piece. He wasn't going to allow that kind of behavior to persist not anymore. As he walked away, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride. He had confronted the situation head-on, just as he had learned to do. The rest of the flight passed uneventfully, and when James returned to the galley, his colleagues exchanged subtle looks of acknowledgement. Michael gave him a small appreciative smile, as if he too understood what had just transpired. After the flight landed and the crew gathered for the post-flight debriefing, Dr. Wilson was there, her usual quiet presence filling the room. As she went over the details of the flight, she paused briefly, looking at James. "I noticed the way you handled the situation with the passenger in row 4, Dr. Wilson said, her voice even but tinged with approval. "That was good work." It's never easy to confront someone like that, especially when it's uncomfortable, but you handled it well. James felt a swell of gratitude. "Thank you," he replied, his voice steady. "I didn't want to let it slide. It felt like the right thing to do." Dr. Wilson nodded, a hint of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "It was, and that's what I've been seeing in you lately, not just good service, but leadership. You're not afraid to step up when it matters." James felt his chest tighten with a mix of pride and relief. He had come so far from being unsure of himself to now standing firm in moments that required not just professionalism, but courage. As he walked out of the debriefing, his resolve only strengthened. He wasn't just a flight attendant anymore. He was someone who could make a difference, not only in the lives of the passengers, but in the culture of the airline itself. In the weeks that followed, James continued to embrace the responsibility that came with his evolving role. Dr. Wilson's words lingered in his mind, and with each passing flight, he noticed himself growing more confident in making difficult decisions. It wasn't always easy, and there were moments when he still struggled to find his voice in challenging situations, but he no longer hesitated to stand up for what was right. One afternoon, during a particularly hectic flight to Mumbai, James found himself facing a new set of challenges. A passenger in the first-class section, an older woman, was causing a disturbance. She had been rude to the staff since boarding, snapping at the crew whenever they approached. James had been observing her from afar, but when she raised her voice sharply at a junior attendant, something in him snapped. James walked straight to her seat, his demeanor calm but firm. "Ma'am, is there a problem?" he asked, his voice carrying steady authority. The woman looked up, her face red with irritation. "Yes, there is. This service is appalling. You people think you're all high and mighty, but you can't even get a simple request right." James took a deep breath, his patience tested, but he didn't let it show. "I'm sorry for any inconvenience, ma'am," he replied smoothly. "But yelling at my crew is unacceptable. If you continue, I will have to ask you to remain in your seat for the remainder of the flight. We expect respectful behavior from all of our passengers." The woman blinked, clearly caught off guard by his calm but unwavering response. For a moment, it seemed like she might argue, but instead, she seemed to deflate, muttering something under her breath. James didn't flinch. "I'll have your request processed immediately, ma'am," James said, standing tall and offering a polite smile. "Please let us know if there's anything else we can assist you with." The woman mumbled something, but this time there was no more shouting. She nodded in silence, finally realizing that her behavior wouldn't be tolerated. James returned to the galley, feeling the weight of the moment settle in. He had done what was necessary, not just for the comfort of the crew, but for the dignity of every passenger. It was a small victory, but James understood its significance. He had stood up for the team, for respect, and for the principles he had worked so hard to internalize. Later, when the plane landed, Dr. Wilson approached him once again, She had been observing the entire exchange, and this time her smile was broad and genuine. "Nicely done, James," she said, her voice full of respect. "You handled that with confidence and professionalism. That's the kind of leadership we need in this role." James felt a deep sense of pride wash over him, but he was quick to deflect. "It wasn't easy," he admitted. "But I've learned that sometimes it's not about the passengers or the service. It's about creating an environment where everyone feels safe and respected." Dr. Duthry. Wilson nodded, her eyes soft with approval. "That's exactly it. You've become a leader, James. Not just in title, but in action. And that's something the entire crew can learn from." As James walked off the plane at the end of his shift, he felt a wave of gratitude for how far he had come. It had been a long, often challenging journey, but he had transformed in ways he never thought possible. The quiet confidence he had now was something he had built piece by piece over time. He knew his work wasn't done. There would always be more to learn, more opportunities to grow. But he also knew that the changes he had made, both within himself and in how he interacted with others, were real and lasting. He wasn't just a flight attendant anymore. He was a leader, someone who could positively impact not just the experience of his passengers, but the entire culture of the airline. As the plane taxied to the gate, James looked out the window at the sprawling Dubai skyline, ready to continue his journey both in the sky and in his own personal growth. For the first time, he truly felt that he had found his place on this plane, among this team, and in his own life. He was exactly where he was meant to be.